Britain, the nation that once ruled a quarter of the globe, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The empire where the sun never set. Mississippi, consistently America's poorest state, ranked 46th in median income, dead last in education. And yet, the average person in Mississippi now has a higher standard of living than the average Brit. Yeah, you heard that right. The poorest American state is richer than the United Kingdom.
Queensbury's got issues, everyone's got issues. Society, no one can afford feeding themselves. Government
This isn't clickbait. This is economic collapse in slow motion. And nobody's talking about it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why London's economy has more in common with Detroit than New York. So buckle up, because this is going to hurt.
The UK's national debt now stands at £2.6 trillion, equivalent to 94% of GDP.
Hello, this is Josh from Fractured Frontiers. Let's start with the numbers because they don't lie. In 2024, Mississippi's GDP per capita sits at roughly $49,000. The United Kingdom, $46,000. Adjusted for purchasing power, Britain now ranks somewhere between Alabama and Mississippi in terms of economic output per person. But here's the kicker. In the year 2000, Britain was 20% richer than Mississippi. Fast forward to today, and Mississippi is 6% richer than Britain. What the hell happened in 24 years? Now, I know what you're thinking. GDP per capita is just one metric. Fair enough. Let's talk about what actually matters. The cost of living. The average UK home costs £290,000. That's about $365,000 US. In Mississippi, the median home price is $250,000. But wait, it gets worse. That British home? On average, it's 40% smaller than the Mississippi one. Energy bills. The average British household pays over £2,000 a year to heat their home and keep the lights on. In Mississippi, around $1,400. That's nearly half. Groceries. A British family spends roughly £600 a month feeding themselves. A comparable Mississippi family, $450. Fuel for your car. In the UK, you're paying £1.50 per litre. That's about $6.80 per gallon. In Mississippi, 90 cents per litre, or around $3.40 per gallon. Do you see the pattern here? The average British family now spends 35% of their income on housing alone. In Mississippi, 18%. But sure, tell me again how Britain's doing fine. Here's something that'll really blow your mind. The average home in Mississippi is 1,876 square feet. In the UK, 818 square feet. You're living in less than half the space for more money with higher bills. Car ownership. The UK has 471 cars per 1,000 people. Mississippi has 650. And when you factor in disposable income after paying for essentials, Mississippi wins by 15%. Your grandparents grew up in a Britain that was objectively wealthier than America's poorest state. You're living in a Britain that isn't. This is the fracture nobody wants to acknowledge. So how did we get here? The answer isn't Brexit. It isn't even the pandemic. This collapse started 50 years ago. The core problem is productivity. And Britain has a productivity catastrophe. Since 2008, UK productivity growth has averaged 0.5% annually. That's glacial. Mississippi, for all its problems, has managed 1.2%. That gap translates to about £5,000 in lost wealth per worker per year. Now here's the thing that drives me insane. British workers work longer hours than Mississippi workers. They're more educated on paper. They're in a supposedly more advanced economy, and yet they produce less economic value per hour worked. This is the silent killer. Why? 3 reasons. First, zombie companies. Britain has kept failing businesses alive through cheap credit and government support. These companies don't innovate, don't invest, and don't grow. They just exist, sucking up resources and dragging down everyone else's productivity. Second, investment drought. The UK invests about 10% of GDP back into the economy. Mississippi, through a combination of private investment and federal infrastructure spending, effectively invests 12%. You can't grow without planting seeds. Third, infrastructure decay. Your trains don't work, your roads are congested, your broadband is slower than South Korea's was 15 years ago. You can't run a modern economy on Victorian infrastructure held together with duct tape and hope. And here's the thing. Still think this is about Brexit? This productivity flatline started under Gordon Brown. It continued through Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, and Sunak. This rot goes deep, deeper than any single policy or political party. But the real economic vampire, housing. Britain has regulated itself into an artificial housing shortage so severe that it's literally eating your economy alive. You build about 200,000 homes per year. You need 340,000 just to keep up with population growth and household formation. You've been running a deficit for decades, and now you're paying the price. The result? Housing costs have consumed an ever larger share of income. In 1990, the average British household spent 20% of income on housing. Today, it's 35%. That extra 15% isn't going into savings, investment, starting businesses, or raising kids. It's going to landlords and mortgage lenders. Meanwhile, Mississippi builds housing as needed, not because they're geniuses, but because they have something Britain doesn't: space. And crucially, they don't have medieval planning laws that make building new housing nearly impossible. Your Greenbelt policy, designed in the 1950s to prevent urban sprawl, has created a permanent housing shortage. Your local councils block developments because existing homeowners vote and prospective homeowners don't. Your entire system is designed to protect asset values for people who already own, at the expense of everyone else. Imagine spending an extra £900 every single month just to live in a smaller space than you would in Mississippi. That's the British housing tax, and it's sucking the life out of your economy, your birth rate, your productivity, and your future. The average Mississippi family lives in a 1,900 square foot home with a yard. The average British family lives in 800 square feet, probably sharing walls with neighbors they can hear through the plaster. Your economy is literally cramped. Now let's talk about the tax trap nobody mentions. The UK's total tax burden is 37% of GDP. The United States sits at 27%. Mississippi's is slightly lower when you account for state-level taxation. Now, in theory, you're paying more taxes to get better public services, right? Scandinavian-style social safety nets, healthcare, education, infrastructure. Except you're not getting that. You're paying Scandinavian tax rates for American-quality public services. Congratulations. You've created the worst of both worlds. Let's break this down. Value-added tax in the UK is 20% on most goods and services. In Mississippi, sales tax is 7%. UK income tax runs from 20 to 45% depending on your bracket. Mississippi income tax ranges from 0 to 5%. You're getting absolutely hammered on taxation, and what are you getting in return? An NHS in perpetual crisis with waiting lists stretching into years. Infrastructure that's crumbling because there's no money for maintenance. Social services that have been cut to the bone. Schools that are underfunded. Universities that increasingly depend on international students paying full freight. Do this mental calculation. Take your current income. Remove 20% VAT from everything you buy. Drop your income tax by 10 percentage points. Cut your energy bills in half. That's what Mississippi living means financially. I'm not saying Mississippi's government is better. I'm saying their tax burden is lower. And paradoxically, people often get more bang for their buck because there's more private wealth left to work with. Speaking of energy, let's talk about Britain's energy suicide. UK energy costs are roughly 3 times what they are in Mississippi. 3 times. For businesses, this is catastrophic. Britain shut down its coal plants without a viable replacement strategy. It invested heavily in offshore wind without adequate storage solutions. It became dependent on natural gas imports. And when global energy markets went haywire, you got crushed. Mississippi, sitting on cheap domestic natural gas with stable grid infrastructure, sailed through relatively unscathed. Here's a real-world example. Tata Steel is shutting down blast furnaces in Port Talbot. Thousands of jobs gone. They're not moving to China or India. They're moving production to facilities in North America. Why? Not labor costs, not regulations, entirely energy costs. You can't run an energy-intensive manufacturing operation when your electricity costs 3 times what it does in competing locations. It's economic suicide. Your deindustrialization isn't some inevitable force of globalization. It's policy-driven. You made choices that priced your own industry out of existence, and the manufacturers aren't coming back. But wait, there's more. The skills exodus. UK doctors are leaving for Australia at rates up 24% since 2019. Tech workers moving to the United States are up 45% since 2020. A recent survey found 61% of finance workers in London are actively considering leaving the country. You spent £200,000 educating a doctor through your system. They work for the NHS for a few years, burn out, and leave for Melbourne where they'll earn 80% more and pay 30% less for housing. This isn't brain drain. This is economic hemorrhaging. And here's the brutal irony. Mississippi can't compete with London's culture, nightlife, history, or sophistication. Nobody's choosing Jackson over London for the theater scene. But Mississippi can compete on purchasing power, on home ownership, on disposable income, on the ability to raise a family without financial terror. And increasingly, that's winning. When your most talented people are leaving because they can't afford to build a life in their own country, you've got a problem that goes way beyond GDP statistics. Now, let me be very clear about something, because I want to be fair here. Mississippi has massive problems. Healthcare outcomes in Mississippi are terrible. Life expectancy is 71 years, one of the lowest in America. Education ranks at the bottom. The poverty rate is still over 20%. Racial inequality remains stark. Mississippi is, by many quality of life measures, not a place you'd want to hold up as a shining example of success. But here's here's the absolutely critical point. All those problems exist in spite of higher disposable income. Mississippi's failures are policy failures and social failures in a relatively wealthy environment. Britain increasingly has those same problems: healthcare crises, education funding gaps, rising poverty, but with less money to address them. Mississippi's tragedy is that it has resources but fails its people through poor governance and historical inequities. Britain's tragedy is that it's losing the resources while also failing its people. Which is worse, a rich state that underperforms or a declining state that can't perform? And it's not just Mississippi. Britain is now poorer per capita than Australia, Canada, and several European countries it used to look down on. Australia's GDP per capita is $66,000, 40% richer than the UK. Canada sits at $54,000, 17% richer. Britain has become the sick man of the Anglosphere. The empire's children have left home richer than the parent. But even within Britain, the fractures are enormous. London's GDP per capita is around £80,000. The rest of the UK averages $35,000. London isn't just richer. London is the UK economy. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all poorer than Mississippi on a per capita basis. The north of England, same story. If you live outside London and the southeast, you're already living in a Mississippi-level economy, except without Mississippi's cost of living advantages. The north-south divide in Britain is worse than the red state-blue state divide in America. At least poor American states get federal transfer payments. What does Sunderland get from London? So what's the path forward, if there even is one? Britain has three options. Option 1. The Singapore pivot. Regulations become ultra-business friendly, attract global capital and talent at any cost, except that London will dominate even more, and the rest of the country will have to find its own way. Go all in on financial services, tech, and high-value services. Become a city-state that happens to have some countryside attached. Option 2. The Mississippi model. Focus relentlessly on reducing the cost of living. Make energy abundant and cheap, even if it means tough choices about climate policy timelines. Build housing like your life depends on it, because economically it does. Prioritize making life affordable for ordinary families over asset price protection for existing homeowners. Option 3. The status quo. Manage decline. Keep muddling through. Watch talent leave. Watch industry leave. Watch living standards stagnate while costs rise. Accept deeper regional inequality. Hope something turns up. Right now, Britain is doing option 3 while pretending it's doing option 1. You can choose to compete, or you can choose to cope, but you can't do both. So here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Britain isn't poor, not yet, but it's becoming poor. And there's a critical difference. You still have world-class universities, global financial institutions, incredible creative industries, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear weapons, for God's sake. But your average citizen, the person just trying to live an ordinary middle-class life, they're now statistically worse off than someone living in Mississippi. That's not an insult to Mississippi. It's an indictment of British economic policy over the last 50 years. The fracture isn't between Britain and America. It's between what Britain was and what it's becoming. And that gap is widening every single year. If you're watching from the UK, I'm sorry, but you needed to hear this. The first step to fixing a problem is admitting you have one. If you're watching from Mississippi, congratulations. You're officially doing better than the British Empire. Nobody saw that coming in 1960. And if you're watching from anywhere else, take notes. This is what happens when a country chooses to manage decline instead of managing growth, when it protects asset prices over productivity, when it values preservation over progress. Britain's story isn't over, but the next chapter is going to be written by the choices you make right now, not the choices you made in the past. The empire is gone. The question is whether the future will be too. This is Fractured Frontiers, where we show you the economic fault lines nobody else will. Hit subscribe if you want more uncomfortable truths. This is Josh, signing off. See you in the next one.